name is Paul Dick. I am an English professor at Canadian Mennonite University, and it's my privilege to introduce this series and Ryan Turnbull, our speaker for this evening. Ryan approached me a few months ago, was it? and with this idea of putting together some lectures on the Anglican poetic tradition. And I think this is a great idea, and this has been something close to my heart for a long time. I've spent most of my career working on George Herbert, reading his poetry and interpreting it, and I think that the poetic tradition of the Anglican Church is a real, one of its greatest resources, actually, and a very important part of Anglican spiritual life. So I'm very excited that Ryan has been putting this together this year. This series of lectures is just part of the Anglican Poetics Project, and maybe Ryan can highlight some of the other things coming up. But without further ado, I'll just say that Ryan Turnbull has recently earned his PhD from Birmingham University in the United Kingdom, and that he is a theologian who works on environmental issues of the land, decolonization. So he's a very socially engaged, environmental thinking theologian, and in this context, I'm especially interested in his thinking about poetry and how those things come together. And I don't know if you're going to go there tonight, Ryan. No. Okay. Well, anyway, later. So tonight, Ryan Turnbull on T.S. Eliot.
I'm immensely grateful to Paul for pulling this together because I basically know Paul in this area of scholarship, and he knows everybody else that we invited. So we've got this great lineup coming up. If you want to hear more, we'll talk a bit more about that at the end of the night, I think. I do also want to flag before I get going that next weekend, Malcolm Geit is coming all the way from the UK, and he'll be doing a one-day conference with Steve Bell at St. George's Crescentwood. There's still time to sign up for that, so if you're interested in that and don't have a ticket yet, make sure to talk to me before the end of the evening. Before I begin, I'd like to take a few moments before I turn to our topic for this evening to talk about this lecture series as a whole. As most things are, the origins of this series are deeply autobiographical and rise from three early impressions that I had when I first encountered the Anglican Church. When I was 18 years old, I read a little book about the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, that talked about both his genius as a theologian and his artistry as a poet. In particular, this book talked about the influence that T.S. Eliot's four quartets had on his thinking, and I, an impressionable youth, decided that I should dedicate myself to reading and rereading in a somewhat obsessive manner these poems in some sort of quixotic effort to understand what made Williams such a compelling figure. I will be honest with you, I'm still not sure if I really understand those poems, but lines and phrases from them have basically completely saturated my imagination, and I'm sure I've driven more than one professor insane with my constant references to these poems in all of my assignments. Well, this all occurred long before I found myself anywhere near attending an actual Anglican church. But I think it's probably a big part of what set me on the Canterbury Trail. Several years later, I ended up at an evening service at St. Margaret's. And what struck both me and my wife Rachel most profoundly about the service was a little sign in the narthex that read, "Enter into the silence of God." After grabbing our service booklets and entering the nave, we were met with a profound and holy silence, so unlike the anxiously chatty evangelicalism we were both accustomed to. This was particularly attractive to my introverted wife, and we used to luxuriate in the silence that seemed to bracket and hold the entire service. But what was held in the silence was a way of worshiping that was at first odd to us, but slowly became essential. Psalms chanted and sung, intercessions, responsories, collects and litanies, at times from the BCP, at others from the BAS. These poetical and scripture-soaked verses captured my heart and imagination, and well, here I am, a professional Anglican. My title with the diocese now is something like Diocesan Discipleship Developer. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, because I'm paid to believe this stuff. Of course, since I am, or at least aspire to be, a theologian, I quickly began asking, which theologians should I be reading to really understand Anglicanism? Now, I want to emphasize that Anglicanism has produced many great theologians, very few of whom we're going to talk about tonight. And indeed, some of the greatest living systematic theologians of our time are actually a group of Anglican women that I call the three great Kates: Catherine Sonderegger, Catherine Tanner, and Catherine Pickstock. But what I was told at the time was that Anglicans don't really have a big theologian in the way that the other Reformation churches do. We don't have a Luther or a Calvin or a Zwingli. Instead, what characterizes Anglicanism is a prayer book and a series of poets. This is perhaps an oversimplification of our tradition, but I think it gets something exactly right about a certain sensibility of Anglicanism. What we've been attempting to do with the Anglican Poetics Project this year is introduce people to this poetic sensibility in as many and as gentle ways as we can. It has something to do with how we read scripture, as our class on John Donne this fall is exploring. Dr. Nate Wall-Bowering here is teaching that class for us. It has something to do with how we engage the broader world, as our poetry workshops throughout the year have explored. Sally spoke at, did a reading for us at this open mic night that we did that was part of a kind of a poetry slam workshop week. So we did a couple of workshops on how to do poetry slam, and that culminated in this night at St. John's College where we had, I think, like 40-ish people out, which was amazing because nightlife at the campus has been absolutely dead since COVID. So that was really great to see. And it has something to do with how we worship and live, as I hope these lectures, these next 6 weeks, will help us explore. Over the next month and a bit, we're going to hear from a fantastic lineup of scholars and poets, thanks to the organizational talents of Dr. Paul Dick, Professor of English at Canadian Mennonite University. We'll hear about Herbert and Vaughan, the Coverdale Psalter, and the Green Man, and what it means to be a poet writing today. And along the way, we'll pilgrimage through a number of beautiful churches across our province. At each stop, attendees can collect a stamp created by the wonderful artist Seika Dick, who also created our logo for the entire Anglican Poetics Project. If you've seen any of our posters for any of our things, there's always this little Anglican Poetics icon in the corner, and she created that for us this year. And make sure to stop by that table over there to grab a stamp that's unique to St. John's Cathedral. We hope this series will invite you into the contemplation of a certain Anglican poetic sensibility that contains within it abundant space for doubt and faith, for despair and joy, for death and life, in sum, for being human. But now to my topic for this evening. I want to begin with silence, for it was in silence that I first encountered this Anglican sensibility we are attempting to gesture at through the Anglican Poetics Project. But silence is difficult. Indeed, this lecture this evening is something of a response to a question posed to me by a Quaker theologian during my viva. My main argument in my PhD was that a way to understand place is as a network of communicative bodies, very esoteric and abstract. And it was here that Dr. Rhiannon Grant gently but wisely intervened and said, well, this is all very interesting, Ryan, but what role does silence play in all of this? I kind of babbled something incoherent at the time that I, for the life of me, can't remember. But this evening, I want to return to the question of silence with some help from the Anglican poet, Thomas Stearns Eliot. I entitled this lecture, There is Not Enough Silence Here, T.S. Eliot and Modern Theology. But really what I should have called the second part of the title was T.S. Eliot and the Possibility of Modern Theology? ? For it is indeed a question as to whether or not theology is even possible today. I raise the possible impossibility of theology for the same reason I want to begin this series with silence. Because I think there is a profound silence and inarticulacy within our church around the fact that all of our beautiful words and silences have been so completely consumed in an act of genocide against Indigenous peoples. Anglicans participated in a mass act of silencing of Indigenous languages and voices, and our ongoing inarticulate silence in the aftermath of this reality continues to leave a gaping wound in our church. This wound of silence continues to inflict wounds on us and on the world around us. We might think of the silence of our church in the face of the genocide in Gaza today. In volume 5 of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which came out a decade ago now, the commissioners turned to a Mi'kmaq poet named Rita Joe to articulate the trauma of Indigenous language loss that the residential schools had inflicted on their communities. Joe writes, "I lost my talk, the talk you took away, when I was a little girl at Shubenacadie School." Joe goes on, asking tentatively if she may use the voice of the colonizer to invite us back into a relationship wherein we might hear her and all Indigenous peoples tell us about themselves. You snatched it away. I speak like you. I think like you. I create like you. The scrambled ballad about my word. 2 ways I talk. Both ways I say. Your way is more powerful. So gently, I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. Joe's childhood silencing was a profound wounding. There was a real loss. Something was snatched away. The snatching has provoked a felt inarticulacy in Joe's life, an inadequacy of her words to ever be heard or received by the colonizer. And so she picks up the powerful talk of the colonizer and invites us into a new silence. It is a wounding silence as well, but instead of inflicting wounds of negation or inarticulacy, it invites a wound of reception. Let me find my talk, Joe gently requests, so I can teach you about me. The invitation Joe offers in her poem, though it is made of words, is, I suggest, an invitation to a transformation of our silence. Let go, Joe urges, of silencing that excludes and negates, and instead embrace silence as a posture of receptivity. And here is where T.S. Eliot might be an unlikely aid in the transformation of our silence. For silence was a constant theme in Eliot's work, but the nature of this silence changed over the course of his life. And it may just point to some theological resources from which Anglicans might draw if our church is to continue to have a vocation in the wake of such profound and wounding failure. Tace et fac, be silent and act. This short Latin motto was the motto of the Eliot family, and it seems to have profoundly shaped the poetry of T.S. Eliot. The first poem Eliot published in a major publication was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which launched Eliot's first raid on the inarticulate, but was ultimately stymied by the limits of language. It is impossible to say just what I mean, Prufrock exclaims, having presumed to say what he knows of the universe, of evenings and mornings, and a life measured out with coffee spoons. But this presumption is met with the refrain, that is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. Eliot, in Prufrock's voice, admits that he is full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. But what is foolish here? Is it the presumption of the offering of a love song to a world that will not, perhaps cannot answer? A world that is falling silent, rendering inarticulate any attempt to say just what he means. There is an edge of atheism, of nihilism in Prufrock's conclusion, as he contemplates a time when he heard the mermaids singing, each to each. But then, in a hallmark move of Eliot's poetic style, in a single line surrounded above and below by blank space on the page, he piercingly remarks, "I do not think that they will sing to me." The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, an inadequate attempt to make words mean what they should, is met and refused by the silence of the mermaids, who will not sing to him. Eliot wrote Prufrock mostly in 1911, but a little bit in 1910. And this period where he writes Prufrock marks a shift from the poetry he had been publishing in the Harvard Advocate while he was a student there from 1907 to 1910. But one can see the foreshadowing of Eliot's struggle with the silence of the world even during this period, in his student period. In 1910, Eliot wrote another short poem. This one did appear in the Advocate. It's entitled simply Silence. Along the city streets, it is still high tide. Yet the garrulous waves of life shrink and divide with 1,000 incidents, vexed and debated. This is the hour for which we waited. This is the ultimate hour when life is justified. The seas of experience that were so broad and deep, so immediate and steep, are suddenly still. You may say what you will. At such peace I am terrified. There is nothing else beside. The poem is divided into 2 stanzas. In the first, the freneticism of the city is depicted as a sea at high tide, rolling with the garrulous waves of life, building to the hour for which we waited. This is the ultimate hour. But what is this hour? Well, the poem doesn't tell you. Or rather, it uses indicative silence to tell you. For though Prufrock is credited as being the poem by which Eliot helps create the genre of modern poetry, it is in this slightly earlier poem, Silence, that we see one of the defining features of modern poetry, the use of silence and blank space on the page as a key part of the poem's meaning. For between the first and second stanzas is an em dash and a blank space. So allow me to reread the transition, this time exaggerating the silence. Along the city streets it is still high tide, yet the garrulous waves of life shrink and divide with 1,000 incidents, vexed and debated. This is the hour for which we waited. This is the ultimate hour when life is justified. And on it goes. The terror in the second stanza can now come into focus. The ultimate hour is just this, the blank space of silence. What's in it? Stillness, peace, but this is a sudden departure from the rough seas of experience, and Eliot is rightly terrified. What is contained within this silence? There's a risk here that the answer is nothing else beside. And well, wouldn't that make absurd the vexed debates of our garrulous city lives? What we see in both Prufrock and Silence is Eliot's confrontation with a type of silence that holds the possibility of nihilism. Silence as negative space. Silence that both arises from our inarticulacy and exposes it. It is the silence of a bravely modern world that has learned that mermaids do not sing for us, but yet dreads what might yet hide within that negation. While the publication of Prufrock rocketed Eliot to fame as a poet, due in large part to the poem's enthusiastic reception by Ezra Pound, Eliot himself soon fell into a despair, worried that he would not be able to repeat the feat. One wonders if this despair with language, this grasping and wrestling and slipping and failing, is what drove Eliot right to the very edges of language, to silence, but to a silence that was beginning to have something more to offer than the nihilism found in Prufrock and Silence. It is this next period of Eliot's life, the period from 1920 to 1927, that we now turn. The period They produced several more of Eliot's most celebrated poems: Gerontion in 1920, The Wasteland in 1922, The Hollow Men in 1925, and Ash Wednesday in 1927, the year Eliot would convert from his vague Unitarian roots to Anglo-Catholicism, being received into the church in a quiet, secret baptismal celebration in the Cotswolds. As an aside, I lived for a year in Prince Edward Island, and we attended St. Peter's, which is the cathedral in Charlottetown. And they are as Anglo-Catholic as it gets there. And they decided that the way they would teach me what it meant to be Anglo-Catholic was to read a bunch of like poets and short stories and stuff. And T.S. Eliot was in the mix. It took me probably the better part of a decade to figure out what they were trying to do with this. But as I was writing this essay today, I was like, oh, okay. Starting to get why they thought the way into what they're all about is to read all these obscurant early 20th century poets and novelists. This period, the 20s, in England is a period haunted by the Great War and the further malaise of modern meaninglessness that characterized life in the city in England. In his 1920 poem, Gerontion, Eliot, who is only 32, takes up the voice of an old man lamenting his own uninvolvement in the momentous events of the past half-decade. I was neither at the hot gates nor fought in the warm rain, nor knee-deep in the salt marsh heaving a cutlass bitten by flies fought. Yet he feels the malaise, the decay of a continent that has suffered profoundly. In the midst of this malaise, Eliot introduces a new theme, a theme that will ultimately draw him to a point of conversion, perhaps because it is the response to the terrible silence he feared in his earlier poetry. The theme introduced in Gerontion will carry through to Ash Wednesday, which he will carry through to Ash Wednesday, is the ancient doctrine of the verbum infans, the word become an infant, or the word born speechless. This is, of course, the doctrine of the incarnation. But while theologians, at least as far back as Augustine, had noted the paradox of a wordless word inherent in an infant God, it is from Lancelot Andrewes, the great translator of at least the Old Testament in the King James Bible, that Eliot takes his cue. In a sermon preached in 1618 for the Nativity, Andrewes, at the height of his elucidation of the doctrine of the incarnation, proceeds, I add yet farther, what flesh? The flesh of an infant. What verbum infants? The word of an infant? The word and not able to speak a word? How evil agreeth this? This he put up. How born, how entertained? In a stately palace? A manger for his... in a stately palace, cradle of ivory, robes of estate? No, but a stable for his palace, a manger for his cradle, poor clouts for his array. This was his beginning. Follow him further, if no better afterwards. What flesh afterwards? In cold and heat, hungry and thirsty, faint and weary. Is his end any better? That makes up all. What flesh then? Black and blue, bloody and swollen, rent and torn. The thorns and nails sticking in his flesh, and such flesh he was made. It is this flesh that comes at the ultimate hour. It is this flesh that gives concrete expression to all of Eliot's inarticulacy. It is this flesh, as St. Augustine wrote so many centuries earlier, that though he who was younger in the world than many of his own servants, in that very world was more ancient than eternity. He who made man became a man. He was created out of a mother whom he created, carried by hands that he formed, suckled at breasts that he filled, wailed in mute infancy in a crib. The word without which human eloquence is mute. It is this flesh, moreover, whose advent Eliot announces in Gerontion thusly, that signs are taken for wonders. We would see a sign. The word within a word, unable to speak a word, swaddled with darkness. In the juvescence of the year came Christ the tiger. Well, no wonder Eliot was so terrified of that sudden stillness in his poem Silence. Christ the Tiger doesn't sound very safe at all. We should notice something here, though, in Gerontian. Unlike his post-conversion poetry, here the word word is not capitalized. It is a human and thus strange word. In Gerontian, then, Eliot prefigures the verbum infans, but is still caught up in the futility of words. The struggle with words is not going to ever abandon Eliot. In verse 5 of Burnt Norton, the Eliot who has found the word, capitalized, still struggles with words. Words move, music moves, only in time, but that which is only living can only die. Words after speech reach into silence. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness, as a Chinese jar still moves perpetually in its stillness. Not the stillness of the violin, while the note lasts, not that only, but the coexistence, or say that the end precedes the beginning, and the end and the beginning were always there, before the beginning and after the end, and all is always now. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, will not stay still. Shrieking voices, scolding, mocking, or merely chattering always assail them. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation, the crying shadow in the funeral dance, the loud lament of the disconsolate chimera. Words go down to death. Words decay. Words strain. They crack and sometimes break. They reach into silence. But there is one word that offers something different. The word, capital, in the desert. The word that in Eliot's conversion poem, Ash Wednesday, is the word without a word. The word within the world and for the world. And the light shone in darkness, and against the word, the unstilled world still whirled about the center of the silent word. This word is a silent word, but it is the word around which the whole world whirls. But if this word is the pivot point around which the whole cosmos turns, where might we find such a wordless word? Well, this question Eliot asks too. And his answer is difficult, but I think necessary. Where shall the word be found? Where will the word resound? Not here. There is not enough silence. There's too much noise. There is far too much noise, Eliot will go on to insist, and not enough grace. There is neither the right time nor the right place to find the wordless word. This is neither. But while that may be true for us here, now in Winnipeg and nowhere, there is a figure to whom Eliot does turn throughout Ash Wednesday, and that figure is the one to whom the word most perfectly comes, the Blessed Virgin Mary. But Mary is also the type par excellence of the church, and this is where I think is Anglo-Catholicism speaking through a bit. And so throughout the poem, Mary is called upon as a Beatrice-like guide, as an intercessor, as a symbol of repair and continuity with a world that in Eliot's earlier poetry refused to sing to him. Yet this highly ramified figure of the Blessed Virgin is punctuated by snatches of liturgy from the penitential rite for Ash Wednesday. Because I do not hope to turn again. Lord, I am not worthy, but speak the word only. O my people, what have I done unto thee? And finally, let my cry come unto thee. Through these snatches of confession and lament, Eliot resorts to the only tools he knows, even as they so often prove to be broken tools. He resorts to words. But not his words only. These are the words of Mother Church, and thus, in a figural way, are the words of Mary herself, the one whom he beseeches to suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. And in that penitential stillness, that silent place where, by way of words, our desperate cry of faith can make its way to the wordless word. Eliot probably had a higher view of the church than I do, but I don't think he was at all naive about the evil the church can accomplish. After all, he watched Christian nations tear the world apart not once, but twice in a span of little more than 20 years, while national churches cheered on the destruction and prayed prayers of blessing over it. Indeed, you probably don't need to look too hard around the cathedral here this evening to still find evidence of this even today. So what does this all amount to? Have I just spent the past half hour bombarding you with, as Eliot puts it in Choruses from the Rock, the endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words, and ignorance of the word? Quite possibly. But what I've been trying to show is that in Eliot's grappling with the limits and failures of words, he discovers a way that words lead us into silence. And in silence, we find the wordless word, who is able to take all of our slip-sliding words and incarnate them in the most astonishing flesh, human flesh, that has felt and borne all that human flesh may bear. I began this lecture by noting that it is possible that theology, and in fact the very life of the church in our time, is entirely compromised, is in fact possibly impossible. And I'm not going to remove that possibility for us entirely this evening. But in the aftermath of genocide, when our words strain, we are left with a couple options. Rowan Williams, in his Gifford Lectures entitled The Edge of Words, has this to say about the limits of language and the potential of silence. There is a gap of silence, at least potentially, between the prompt from an environment and the unique verbal acknowledgement and following of it that will emerge. The unfinished character of language means that we are always aware of what has not yet been said, even if we have no way of knowing what exactly it will be. And so, once again, a gap opens up within what we are saying between any particular utterance at any one time and the actuality to which the utterance witnesses, or with which it seeks to be aligned, because there will always be another perspective to be admitted, a perspective not yet voiced and heard. Even in the normal unfolding of our language, Williams insists that there is this way that silence kind of like welcomes it onward, and as you're kind of having a conversation with whoever you're having a conversation with, what's left unsaid kind of calls you into saying something new, or bids you fall silent again as you hear. So there's this kind of like give and take between silence and words that's necessary for both of them to proceed. We might be in a time where Christian language has become unspeakable. Dietrich Bonhoeffer floated this idea for German Christians at the end of World War II, and between the sins of the Canadian church and the rising Christofascism of the American church, English-speaking Christianity sure looks like it might be headed for a similar reckoning. But this might be okay. In fact, this might be a chance for us to rediscover silence. Not as a kind of quietism, not as a tool by which we negate the voices and lives of others, but as a receptive, indicative reality wherein Christ comes to meet us. Where can I go from your presence, O Lord? Asks the psalmist. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I loudly pronounce your word, you are there. If I make my way wordlessly, your wordless word whirls me about. This, I think, is where the poets of the Anglican Church may need to help us. For as scholar Katarzyna Dudek observes, the poet is the one who hears the saying of the language, that which has not yet been said, and that which must remain unsaid. A poem thus rises out of the tension between inadequate public language, idle talk, and that which has to be left unsaid, but struggles to communicate itself. The Anglican tradition holds a great deal of incredible poetry, both in our liturgical resources and in the work of poets that have had an array of difficult and profound relationships with the church. If there is to be a way forward for Anglican theology, for the Anglican Church as such, I think it will be with the poets. For it is the poets, not the theologians, who are best suited to take us to the edge of language and force us into communion with the kind of wordless word whose flesh has borne the scourge of Shubenacadie Residential School too. The wordless word that beckons to us within Rita Joe's invitation to put down our powerful talk and stand silent before the testimony of others. This will be painful for many of us. But who then devised the torment? Love. And it is love that is in the unfamiliar name, the unfamiliar face that our silencing left black and blue, bloody and swollen, rent and torn. And so to take my own advice, I will now fall silent, but not before giving Eliot the last word, especially since we are in this place where our diocese comes to pray. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than an order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind, or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Here, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always. Amen.